Sage Wanderer here, and welcome to my cabin down by the creek. I want to talk today about what's going on in the Middle East. You're going to hear over the course of the next several weeks a lot of distorted accounts of history. You're going to hear propaganda from both sides. You're going to hear part of the truth. You're going to hear deep dive studies into what has occurred in Israel and Palestine over the past 15 years or so. But leave it up to Sage Wanderer to go back to the beginning of the story. And that's why the title of this video is 75 Years of War in Palestine. Now, this story starts in the 1800s. But before we get going, I want to encourage you to support this channel. I'm bringing you a bonus video today. The nature of this channel is going to once again morph a little bit, because whereas conflicts up until now have not too greatly affected your daily life, I'm telling you this one's going to. This one is going to affect your daily life, and you need to have a very clear understanding of the genesis, the beginning of this conflict. It will help you better understand the intensity of it and the crimes against humanity that are going to and have been committed during, the atrocities that are going to be and have been committed during this conflict, which is going to broaden, in my opinion. So I want to make sure you have a firm foundational understanding of the nature of this conflict. And we start at the beginning on this channel. We don't start in the middle. I'm not starting 10 years ago. You can change people's opinions one way or the other by where you start in this story. And the only way for you to come to your own conclusion, for you to fully understand the brutality of what is going on today, you have to go back to the genesis of all of this. Now, this territory we call Israel or Palestine was at one point part of the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Empire. Under the Turkish Empire, Arabs of Muslim faith and traditional Jews who are native to Israel, they lived in more or less harmony for centuries. And under the Ottoman rule, that was no different. That Jews and Arabs lived side by side. They lived in relative harmony. But that all began to change due to immigration. And that immigration has to do with a lot of different factors. Essentially, this war, this hatred of Israel by the Palestinians, is because Israelis migrated to Palestine. And in so many ways, this is a migration war. This is a war by the Palestinians against the migration of more Israelis, more Jews coming from around the world to call Israel their home. So at the time of the Ottoman Empire, this area was under the rule of the Turks, and the Jews were allowed to live there, and there's not a lot of history during this period of time because there's not a lot to talk about. But the Turks sided on the wrong side during World War I, and they lost the war. And the Turkish Empire was carved up between the Western nations who won in World War I. And so the area that we now know as Palestine, and most of the area of Jordan, part of the area of Syria, and part of the area of Saudi Arabia became known as the British Protectorate, as the British took control of this area after World War I. They were in charge, and we could get into the atrocities committed on both sides during this period, but this was a time of colonial occupation and control by the British. And at the end of World War II, Great Britain had expended a great deal of its resources. It had put everything it had into defending the homeland of England. And at the end of the war, it was ready to let go of a lot of its pre-war obligations and colonialization efforts. India got its independence in 1947, and several other countries that slipped my mind. Pakistan was given independence from British rule in 1947 as well. And the British expressed the desire to withdraw from the British protectorate area we now call as Palestine and Jordan. And they turned the decision on what to do with this land over to the United Nations. The United Nations began negotiation. The first thing that was done is that Palestine was separated from Jordan, and Jordan became its own country. And the lines that separated some of this territory were given to Syria and to Saudi Arabia, respectively. And we have the section of Israel, the map as we now know it, was laid on the table, and the discussion was who's going to rule Palestine. Will it be the majority, which were Palestinians, and what was to become of the people of Israel of Jewish descent? Now, the Jews wanted their own homeland, and this desire started in the 1800s. That there's always been Jews in Palestine, that since Roman days there has been Jews that have lived in this region. They survived the fight between Islam and Christianity during the Crusades, and they've been there the whole time. But in the 1800s, immigrants started coming there and joining them from all over the world. And they came there not as conquerors, not as invaders. They came there as immigrants. And there was a open immigration policy to Jews for the first portion of this. And in the late 1800s, Jews began to come there, and they brought with them the technology of mechanical irrigation. And so Jews that were immigrating to Palestine while it was still under British rule, or it's still under Turkish rule, and later on while it was under British rule between World War I and World War II, brought with them the technology of mechanized irrigation. And so they bought up large tracts of land in areas of Palestine that the Palestinians didn't care about, areas that were very far away from the traditional areas, basically around Tel Aviv, the coastal plains. That this is the natural homeland for Jews for many centuries. And when they came to Palestine, they couldn't really afford to purchase land in those more highly occupied areas. And so they bought land from the Palestinians that was relatively useless land. It was land that had never been farmed. They didn't bother farming it. It was very much a desert. And so you have this event where in the late 1800s and early 1900s, these Jewish immigrants come there, and they begin to purchase up this land, and the Palestinians willingly sell it to them because it's of little worth to them. And they bring this technology of mechanized irrigation to Palestine, and the desert blooms. Under this new form of farming, Israelis were able to turn previously desolate areas into viable farmland. And it was at this point that Palestinians went, hey, why didn't we think of that? Right? And they began to see value in land that they had sold previously, and because it had been seen as being worthless. And so more and more Israelis or Jews come to Palestine, and you have this huge influx of immigration from all over the world, even America. And Jews start to come to Israel with the hope of someday having an Israeli homeland, with the hope of buying some of this cheap property and farming it. And this starts to rub Palestinians the wrong way. They start to feel like they're being replaced. They start to feel like there's more of them than they want. And so they petition the British government to limit or even eliminate Jewish immigration into Palestine. This is something that the British agreed with. They were just trying to keep the peace there. And by the time at the end of World War II, you find the British government pulling back from all of their colonization efforts and releasing land and properties back to the nations that they had originally conquered, sometimes centuries earlier. And so part of this was the release of the Palestinian territory that we now call Israel. And so the British just basically wanted out. They fought against both sides during times of civil unrest in this transitionary period. And in 1947, the United Nations starts to broker a deal to divide Palestine between Israel and a Palestinian homeland. So when people talk about the two-state solution, this is something that was offered to Palestinian Arabs from the very beginning of the release of British control in that nation and the offering of independence to Palestine. And so the United Nations starts brokering a deal, and there were basically two deals on the table. Deal number one, we have a unified Palestine that includes both Israelis and Palestinians, and we would hope that they would form a nation together, find a way to get along, put an end to this hostility that had, this anti-immigration hostility that was coming from the Palestinians, and therefore allow Israel to be part of a unified Palestine. But when analysts looked into the cultural underpinnings of what was going on there, when they looked at the history, when they talked to the people who were in charge from the Palestinian side, they began to realize that the Palestinians did not want this. The Palestinians and all of the Arab nations saw these new immigrants into Israel as a plague, as a invasion. And so this anti-Jewish immigrant hostility gets to the point where the United Nations believes that they're going to be unable to ensure that the Israelis or the Jewish people will not be summarily executed and killed, and their civilization driven into the sea. And this even threatened not just new immigrants, but all Jews living in Israel at the time, that they were all lumped together as one body. And of course, as Israel grows, as the influx of immigration comes forward, and even though the British were trying to stop it, many immigrated in anyway. It was hard to keep them out. The British were unable to control Jewish immigration, and more Jewish immigrants start to pour into Palestine. And that helps to fuel the animosity between the Palestinians and the Jews. And so at the United Nations, they decide that Palestinians can't be trusted to take care of the Jews that are already there, and that a mass genocide against the Jews was likely, open warfare was likely. So the decision to offer a two-state solution was put on the table and voted on by all of the nations of the world. The vast majority of the nations agreed to this, as well did Israel agree to it. And the land that was going to be given to Israel and to Palestine, the Palestinians were being offered a lot more land than they would ever actually get once the conflict became a thing. That the original deal offered to the Palestinians, the two-state solution by the United Nations, that Israel agreed to, that a majority of the international community agreed to, was rejected by all of the Arab states, all of the bordering Arab states, all of the states that are ethnically and religiously related to Palestinians, all rejected this, of course, along with the Palestinian people en masse. They rejected the two-state solution. They didn't want their own country. They just wanted the Jews gone. They just wanted the Israelis out. And they wanted a Arab Palestine. And they weren't going to accept anything less than that. But the UN resolution is passed anyway, dividing the territory between Palestinian territory and Israeli territory, which includes every part that we call Israel now. And the Palestinians saved the West Bank and all the land right up to Jerusalem, a section in the north that borders Lebanon, as well as the Gaza Strip. And this was offered to the Palestinians at this time in 1947, and they rejected it. And when the resolution was passed anyway, the Israelis, because you got to understand, these arbitrary lines that they put in place were not indicative to the actual population, that there were Jewish settlements in the section of Palestine that was being given to the Palestinians, and there were Palestinian cities within the area of Israel that was being partitioned by the United Nations. And this is where the problems arise. And the rest of the story from here on out is going to give you some insight as to why this attack by Hamas was so brutal, why this attack by Hamas was where they killed men, women, children, and now we're hearing reports of babies being beheaded. And this that you're getting from me is not based in any of the modern propaganda, but a study of the historical facts. That during this period leading up to the 1948 war that would cause Israel to become a nation, that this partition that was created by the United Nations was rejected by Palestine and accepted by the Israelis. Now, the people that lived in Palestine, the Israelis that lived in little enclaves in the Palestinian desert, that their area was given to Palestine and they found themselves in a tight position. And I believe their hopes were to stay right there and farm their land that they had legally purchased, that they owned, that they had purchased from Palestinian landowners. And they believed that they could be part of the Palestinian government, that Palestine would not eject them, and that is not what happened. So the small enclaves of Jewish settlements in the Palestinian area, once again, the Palestinians saw the entire nation as their area. But those areas that were, those enclaves that were in the Palestinian partitioned area were seen as the first area that needed to be have the Jewish people removed from. And so they didn't offer to buy their land and buy them out. They didn't give them any ultimatums. It's just suddenly the groundswell of anti-Jewish sentiment in the Palestinian zone became so strong that several of these small farming communities were simply destroyed. That a combination of militia and local townspeople in surrounding areas descended on some of these communities, and they came there not to force them out. They didn't come there to create refugees or to send these people back to the Israeli partition. They came there to eradicate them, and a purge of Jewish people from Palestinian areas became the norm. Now, in the first few of these, it was a massacre. And the Palestinians at that point decided that all Jews were intruders, that all Jews were not welcome, and that all Jews must be removed from the entirety of Palestine. They had not accepted the two-state solution. They rejected this two-state solution right up until recent times. The Palestinians weren't going to negotiate. They just wanted all Jews out of Palestine. And that included the Israeli portions as well. And so these small enclaves, kibbutz, something like that, these little collective farming communities were targeted by Palestinians, and the people there, to every man, woman, and child, was massacred. And at first there was very little resistance. They just came in and massacred what would be considered peaceful people. In one instance, a small enclave of of Israeli Jews who had escaped the Holocaust, had bought land prior to the partition in what is considered the Palestinian areas. They purchased it legally. They were there legally. And when the partition was created, immediately upon the withdrawal of the British, and the partitioning of Israel into Palestine and Israel at the United Nations in 1947 is almost simultaneous. And as soon as the United Nations took over, the British, who had been keeping peace there, who had been being shot at by both Israeli insurgents and Palestinian insurgents in the battle for their independence from Great Britain and the end of the British protectorate there, the British, as soon as they started withdrawing and the protections were lifted and the threat of intervention by a third party was gone, these enclaves of Israelis in Palestinian territories were targeted. Almost immediately upon the first couple of ones that were destroyed and all the people massacred, including men, women, and children. Because here's the bottom line. If you believe the people shouldn't be there, then you don't delineate between men, women, and children. Children will just grow up to be combatants. And that is the way that Palestinian people believed then. It's what they believe now. They don't believe in the two-state solution, and they never have. They never accepted it, and they see the Israelis, the Jewish people, as invaders in their country, and they make no demarcation line between combatants, military, civilians, women, or children. And in these attacks against the Israelis, every man, woman, and child was killed. So at the same time, you have a similar effect happening in the Israeli side of the partition. The Israelis also have small towns and cities that are owned and operated by Palestinians from antiquity. And they handled them very different, even in the face of these massacres of these settlements that were in Palestine. As a Texan, I'm always going to be tempted to say Palestine. But as these massacres started happening, even in the face of these massacres, the Israeli response was twofold. One was to go ahead and eject the Palestinians from the Israeli areas, but they gave them the opportunity to become citizens, swear allegiance to Israel, recognize Israel as its own nation, and join the Israeli culture and life. And they weren't asking them to give up their religion. They weren't necessarily seizing their lands unless they refused to join the Israeli government and basically become Israelis. And so they were offered citizenship, which the vast majority of them rejected. And so you have this back and forth war that starts to happen even before Israel declares itself a nation in 1948. You have this warfare that's been going on where the Israelis force out Palestinians, drive them across the border, kill anyone who fights back against them, but they spare the women and the children. They spare anyone who says that they're not here to fight and is not picking up arms. And they drive many of these Palestinians and create refugees on a massive scale, driving Palestinians back into the Palestine partition area, according to the 1947 UN Resolution 181, if my memory serves correctly. And so you have this dynamic where the Jews are being eradicated on the Palestinian line, and the Palestinians are being expelled on the Jewish side. And so this would break out into a greater warfare, mainly around Jerusalem. Jerusalem had a significant portion of it that was occupied by Israelis, by Jews, going back to antiquity. These were ancestral lands that had been in the possession of Jews through all of these wars, through the Ottoman Empire, through World War I and World War II. And now this section that contains Jerusalem as part of the 1947 UN Resolution 181, I'm going to go with that. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. But this UN resolution declared Jerusalem to be an international area, and there were supposed to be UN peacekeeping police forces there to keep the peace in Jerusalem, to keep Jerusalem open for religious pilgrims of the three major religions, because there's sites there that are holy to both Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. And so the effort was to make Jerusalem a demilitarized safe zone patrolled by United Nations. That never got to happen because war broke out too quickly. So the war was well underway by the May 1948 Declaration of Independence by the Israeli government, creating an Israeli homeland. Okay? The Palestinians were never okay with that. They didn't recognize them. And right immediately on the Declaration of Independence that occurred in May of 1948, I believe a 7-nation army, don't quote me, I could be wrong there, rose up and declared war against this new Israel that they did not recognize as having a right to exist. And they came in to support the Palestinians. This included Egypt in the south, Jordan to the east, and Syria and Lebanon to the north. And so these four major nations, along with Iraq, which isn't even border there, they sent tanks. The Israeli people had no armaments. They've been defending themselves with basic, what we consider Second Amendment weapons, basic rifles and pistols. In some cases, they were defending themselves literally in a hand-to-hand way against other armed insurgents, other armed factions of the Palestinian people. And so now they're faced with this invasion from these very militarized modern armies that are coming from Iraq, coming from the king in Jordan, coming from Syria, coming from Egypt especially. So they all invade essentially at the same time with a multi-pronged encirclement of Israel. And what some would consider under the providence of God, almost a supernatural intervention, and ironically, with the help of Czechoslovakia, a Soviet Union nation, they received some arms that they were able to smuggle past the British that were still controlling the Haifa port. I think right on the heels of the withdrawal is when the Israelis began to import arms, things like airplanes, tanks, armored personnel carriers, small arms, machine guns, that sort of thing. And they draft pretty much everybody in the nation to defend the nation, and they were able to crazily defend themselves against these much superior forces. And one could almost argue that 2 French-made artillery pieces saved a lot of Israel from being taken in this war. And they were able to force the Iraqis to withdraw. They were able to force Jordan to a peace agreement, to a ceasefire, and eventually they were able to drive Egypt out of their territory. So when you understand that if the Palestinians had taken the United Nations offer to begin with, when this was originally partitioned, they would have a nation much larger than current Israeli territory. That the Palestinians, and where they're allowed to live now, which is essentially the West Bank, the Jordan border there, the Gaza Strip, which is bordered in the south by Egypt, and the rest of it is either bordered by Israel or the Mediterranean Sea. And what they have now is just a tiny portion of what they were offered, but they wouldn't accept it. And as we examine the 75 years of this warfare from 1948 until now, you will see how the Palestinians always rejected their own nation. They didn't want their own nation. They wanted the Israelis out. They wanted the Jews, men, women, and children, dead or driven into the sea. And they never come to the table and negotiate. They only have one option from the Palestinian and the greater Arab world, is to get the Jews out of Israel. And they were never willing, no matter how many times they lost, no matter how much bloodshed, no matter how much territory they lost in these conflicts, they never wanted their own nation. They wanted all of it or nothing at all. And they have been willing for generations to fight to the death. So hopefully this will show you why the Hamas that invaded Israel from the Gaza Strip this last weekend, why they were so brutal. We're going to talk about other reasons that created this brutality. But from the beginning, brutality and a lack of compromise and a desire for death to Israel has been fueling this conflict from the very beginning. They were never willing to accept splitting Palestine into an area and allowing Israel to exist. They weren't then, and honestly, they still aren't now. They don't want the Gaza Strip that they were given to. They want all of Israel, and they're willing to kill every man, woman, and yes, child to make that happen. They don't see Israelis as human. They see Israelis as a plague, as a virus that's supposed to be eradicated. This is why they could engage in the kind of atrocities that turns the stomach of the Western world, and especially set America back on its heels. We couldn't believe that they would attack this rave filled with young people who have nothing to do with this conflict, who were just there to dance, and kill 260 of them, taking many more of them hostage back to whatever evil ends they have waiting for them in the Gaza Strip. Now, Iran plays a big role in this. We could, as we progress in this study, something that's going to happen on this channel is I'm going to talk more and more about this topic without giving up my preaching, because you're going to need the supernatural spiritual skills to deal with the coming chaos. I'm telling you right now, this is that generation spoken of in Matthew 25, in Matthew 24 rather, when Jesus says, this generation shall not pass away until all of these things have come to pass. And here's a bit of information for you. One might argue a generation is 30 years, but I think it's clear that Jesus is saying that the people that were born at the beginning of this conflict will still be alive, many of them, at the end of this conflict, that they won't all be passed away. So people that were born before 1948 and before, that are still alive today, will still be alive when all of this wraps up and the second coming happens. I do believe beyond a shadow of a doubt that this resurgence of this conflict and this escalation is going to become global, and it's going to literally be the patchwork that creates the end times and the tribulation period and the rise of the beast and all of it. The destruction of Israel is moving to the top of the priority list for every Arab nation. They have celebrated the massacre of innocent Israeli civilians, men, women, and children. They celebrated these Palestinian immigrants in New York City itself, and in every major city around the country. There were celebrations of this atrocity, that this massacre of men, women, and children, non-combatants, unarmed people by the Palestinians is seen as justified, and is going to be joined, I'm afraid, by some of these nations. Let's hope Egypt stays out of it this time. They might not. But you can expect Iran, Syria, and Lebanon to be in the middle of this fight. And it's going to draw in the United States into a war. This is going to cause gas prices to go through the roof, even if we don't get involved. And so this is going to be affecting you for the foreseeable future. I believe this might very well mark the beginning of the 7-year tribulation period. If you were inclined to think that the rapture was going to be pre-tribulation, I think you missed the boat. Either you were wrong or you got left behind, and me too, because this is the beginning of the book of Revelation's tribulation period. This is the last possible chance for the prophecy of Jesus Christ to come about, where the people that were born at the beginning of this conflict would still be around when it all wraps up. We're exactly 75 years from the foundation, 75 and a few months from the foundation of the nation of Israel. This is the bud on the fig tree spoken of in the Bible, and those who were alive in 1948 will not all be gone before this is over. I hope you watch this channel. I hope you appreciate my perspective on this. I'm going to mix current events, history, the news, and Bible prophecy to help guide you through this end time process. I do believe at least for 3.5 years from here on out, we're going to have to endure some hardships. We may have to ride the full 7-year period out, and I will be right here advising you every step of the way. But I do need your financial support. My views have been way up and my donations way down. I know we're in hard times, but if you don't take care of this channel, it will go away, because I can't work full time and do the things I need to do. And God has called me to step up production, to produce more than just my 3 videos a week. My 3 videos a week were sermons for the first year. Then God called me to pull in the coffee talks again, to draw back some of my lost viewers who are political viewers who appreciated the coffee talks back into the channel, for hopes that they would be here ready to engage in the next leg of this journey, is where I talk about the current events, prophecy, and the end of times as we live through it. So I do need your help and your support. You'll find a PayPal link in the description, as well as a Cash App link. You'll find my Twitter page there, where I'm going to expand into Twitter, because right now I think YouTube's allowing us to talk about this. But I do think the battle lines will be drawn there as well. And in the future, this video might be taken down in retrospect. So I'm gearing up. I got the laptop computer ready to go. I'm gearing up and getting ready to make Twitter a bigger part, X as it were, a bigger part of what we're doing here, and I need your support for that. So please make a donation, like and subscribe, share these videos, talk to your friends about what's going on, and don't let the propaganda coming from both sides deter you from the historical perspective. Palestinians have been merciless when it comes to the Jewish immigration into that country, and they see them as invaders, and they will show no mercy. And unfortunately, it has rubbed off on the Israelis as well. And the sheer number of innocents that are being killed on both sides is going to continue to be mind-boggling. That this is the kind of conflict and war that, honestly, the civilized world has never seen. And it's going to get worse. And it's going to spread to this country. We have instantly, because of our support for Israel, we have once again become a target for terrorism. And with a porous southern border, you can expect that terrorists have been and will continue to be flowing into our country. And cells of covert cells of terrorists will be activated. And you will see violence on U.S. soil because of this event. But we are here to guide you spiritually. I'm here to guide you historically and give you some perspective. And we'll also talk about preparation and security as well. So this is a one-stop shop for everything to do with the Great Tribulation, which I believe we just entered. What do you think? Tell me in the comments section. I will say this. If you're going to be Jew-hating, if you're going to act like a Nazi, if you're going to suggest bizarre conspiracy theories that are not based in fact and based in your hatred against the Jewish people, you will be deleted from this channel, your comments, and eventually you will be banned as well if you continue it. So you've been warned. You don't got to be pro-Israel, but you do have to be sane, right, and not a racist, okay? I'm not a racist against Arabs in general. I'm judging the Palestinians by their previous behavior and their previous actions. And I'm going to show you how the generational hatred of Israel is alive and well in these young Hamas fighters. And they are in control of the Gaza Strip and its government. And you will see this spread to Iran, to Syria, to Jordan, and to the streets of the United States. We'll see you next time from Sage's cabin in the woods.